So it's over. There will be no currency union if Scotland votes for independence. These are not the words of a politician, but a Treasury mandarin. This is about economics, not politics.
Well, let's deal with the three politicians first, because I see it as bluff, bluster and bullying. Bluff because what they say now and what they say the day after a yes vote are two entirely different things. Bluster because we're expected to believe that the Osborne idea is to tell businesses in England next year at the UK general election that he wants to impose a new tax on them of several £100 million for the privilege of exporting their goods to Scotland. And bullying because the days of Westminster politicians dictating to Scotland are over. In fact, one of my predecessors, former First Minister Henry McLeish, still a no voter at this stage, described it as threatening behaviour today. So I think it will backfire spectacularly on the unionist politicians involved.
But let's put this in a different perspective. Let's put it in the perspective of a Whitehall mandarin who is not political, he's entirely apolitical. And he says that it would not be good for the rest of the United Kingdom. He strongly advises there to be no currency union as the current position that you're taking, the one you advocate. Part of the problem here, Alex Salmond, is that you have said that you would take sterling, but perhaps for a short or limited period of time. In the letter, which I'm sure you have read, he makes the point that if you would be more permanent about how long you would take sterling for, there might be wriggle room. It might be a different answer. Why won't you just negotiate and say, OK, we will take sterling for 40, 50 years?
Well, I'm perfectly happy to negotiate now, but the only talks that we've had have been technical talks with the truly independent Bank of England, and I've been delighted with the progress in these technical talks.
Would you now tonight, though, because you say you're happy to negotiate, would you say that?
No, but listen, Kirsty, for more than a year now, the Scottish Government has been saying to Whitehall, not just the mandarins, but the politicians, we'd be very happy to negotiate these guidelines, very happy indeed to, but they've been saying we won't pre-negotiate on anything. And the only exception to that, of course, 2 years ago was Mervyn King, who authorised, as the independent central bank, technical discussions which bore fruit in the Fiscal Commission Working Group paper. Now, to answer your question directly, very happy to have these negotiations. Actually, I thought the wriggle room in Sir Macpherson's letter surely was where he said, as currently proposed. I mean, the wriggle room was coming from the senior mandarin, I thought, rather than anything else. The only thing I say about that...
I just want to absolutely to talk to you about this quite specifically, because you are very clear. You want to be open and upfront. You say there are negotiations. Are you prepared to put an actual time limit on sterling? Are you prepared to say that you would take sterling for 40 or 50 years?
Well, if you look at the framework that the Fiscal Commission Working Group proposed, it was designed to last the test of time. There's a range of options, of currency options for Scotland. The best one, we think, for Scotland, and indeed for the rest of the United Kingdom, is the sterling zone that we accepted
but
from
yes
the
or
Fiscal
no, Alex
Commission.
Salmond, would you put a time limit of, say, half a century?
Well, we're perfectly prepared to have these negotiations now,
so
Kirsty.
You won't say it.
Well, you asked me first if we would have negotiations. I said yes. I've also pointed out, if you look at the Fiscal Commission Working Group, it's not a temporary arrangement that's proposed. And as for the argument, incidentally, that there are other politicians who want to do different things. I mean, I was in the House of Commons when the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, wanted to join the euro, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer Gordon Brown, wanted to keep sterling. That is part of the democratic process, but perfectly happy to have these negotiations in the interests of Scotland and in the interest of the people of England as well, because, you know, I know that George Osborne doesn't speak for Scotland.
Well,
I don't think he speaks for England, the people of England, or indeed the businesses of England, who he wants to impose the Osborne tax on.
You have said in the past that if there was to be no currency union, there would be no paying up of Scotland's share of the 1.6 trillion debt. If there is no currency union in the event of a yes vote in Scotland, will you or will you not pay a share of the debt?
Well, Kirsty, our proposition is that we should have a share of the assets and of the liabilities. That's what's fair and reasonable. That is our proposition as set out in the White Paper. Now, one of these assets is undoubtedly the Bank of England. It was nationalised in 1946. It holds title to almost a third of UK debt at the present moment. It's George Osborne who seems to be suggesting that we're not entitled to a share of that asset, but he wants to land us with all the liabilities.
So you won't pay the debt?
Well, I'm making it clear that our proposition, which is in the interests, we believe, of Scotland and the rest of the UK, is to have a share of the assets and a share of the liabilities. That's our proposition. It's George Osborne is putting forward the one-sided argument that we're not entitled to a share of the asset, but he wants us to be stuck with the liabilities. And clearly, that's not fair or reasonable.
So that's not fair. So let's assume you wouldn't pay the debt. Let me take you back to the letter. Sir Nicholas Macpherson says in the letter that even if Scotland did not pay its share of the 1.6 trillion debt, it would still be better than having a currency union. It would still be better not to have that money than to have a currency union with Scotland.
Well, again, his wiggle room would be as currently proposed. That's why we should have negotiations. But listen, I thought the most interesting thing about dragging a civil servant into this, as a kind of shield for George Osborne, is what will Sir Nicholas Macpherson do when somebody asks him for his advice to the Chancellor on the economic consequences of withdrawal from the European Union? Now we set this rather strange precedent, but we're very happy to have negotiations and to clarify these things so that the senior mandarin understands what exactly we're proposing, because in some elements of his letter, he seems to misunderstand that very badly.
Let's move on to what Jim Siller said. He can't believe someone as smart as Alex Salmond wouldn't have a plan B. Let's talk about a plan B. Have you got a plan B if there's no currency union?
Well, Kirsty, the Fiscal Commission Working Group set out a range of options, of currency options for Scotland. We then chose what they said was the best option, which was to have a sterling area between Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. And the key thing we're looking at is to not have transaction costs, not transaction costs for Scottish businesses exporting to England, our major market, or English businesses exporting to Scotland. England's
Denmark bears these transaction costs, and Denmark is a different situation. Denmark, as you look to Scandinavia for a lot, Denmark has an independent currency pegged to the euro. Why not have an independent currency pegged to sterling?
Well, I was explaining that. The Fiscal Commission looked at that option, and it's a perfectly credible option. Nobody's saying it's not. At least I don't think anybody's saying it's not. But the best option is not to have these transaction costs, which would be important for Scotland, but also important for businesses for England. I mean, what Osborne and Balls are saying is they're going to have an Ed and George tax of several £100 million on businesses in England for exporting to Scotland. That's simply incredible, and nobody in England is going to accept that.
But we're in a situation 5 months from a referendum where you are making threats about assets and liabilities as much as George Osborne might be making threats. People in Scotland want a detailed argument, and the problem is that on something like the debt, what Sir Nicholas Macpherson says that if you do not take a share of the debt, then your credibility in the markets and everything else will not be substantial. You will attract higher rates of interest and so forth. It is not a tenable position to hold.
Well, can I put it forward again? Our position is we should share assets and liabilities. It's George Osborne who's suggesting the one-sided position that somehow we're not entitled to a share of assets, but he wants to stick us with the liabilities. And I'm sure if Sir Nicholas Macpherson was working for me as opposed to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, then he'd see the fairness and justice of that position. And as for interest rates in terms of the international marketplace, I mean, you mentioned the Nordic countries. I mean, Denmark, Sweden, Austria, Belgium, all have lower interest rates, bond yields at the present moment than the UK has. So, the UK interest rates are not unreasonable, but they're not as good as many other countries in Europe at the present moment.
Alex,
so I think let's get these things into some perspective.
Thank you very much,
Thank you,
Alex
Kirsty.
Thank you.